He was in constant discomfort. It was really a horrible condition of life that he had at the end. What he did was wait until I was out of the house with the children, and then he took some drugs that he'd acquired online and ended his own life. And he didn't tell me he was going to do that because he wanted to keep me safe from prosecution. So he did this, I think, enormously courageous, loving thing, and he died. My name's Sarah Tarlow, and I'm Professor of Historical Archaeology at the University of Leicester. And what I've always worked on in my academic life is the archaeology of death and burial. And I've been really interested in how people, through time, have structured that relationship between the living and the dead. How do people relate to their own dead and to the ancestors of their people and so on? So that's something I've always been interested in studying, and particularly whether there are ways in which we as archaeologists can get at the experience of being a person in the past. Things like the emotional experience, which obviously death is a really emotional experience. So that's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. But in a way, it was all quite abstract for me until 2016, when my husband, Mark, died. And that was a very personal experience of bereavement. And as a consequence of that, a few years later, I wrote a memoir called The Archaeology of Loss, which explores both my own experience of caring and Mark's death, talks about that period, and also I wanted to interweave that with some of my professional experience as an archaeologist specialising in that area.
It's fascinating, and obviously we want to talk about that and your book. Going back a little bit, what first made you want to study or explore that particular area of archaeology?
Yeah, I came into it through theory, actually. I was interested in archaeological theory. Most people come in because they like digging.
Digging. Digging
and I do like digging,
brushing.
And it's fun. And you get to go and camp in the countryside with your friends, and that's a lot of fun. And that's all good stuff. But actually, when I found out that archaeology also is about thinking, and it's about the intellectual challenge of taking inadequate data, you haven't got nearly enough evidence, you've just got little bits and pieces and scraps that don't really fit together very well. How can you take all of those scraps and then knit them together into something that tells us about people in the past? And I just loved that challenge. And so I started thinking as a graduate student about whether we could use theories of metaphor that have been developed for talking about language. Can we use those to talk about material culture, about the way that people deploy things? And I thought one interesting place to look for that is death, because we always talk about death in metaphorical ways. We talk about people falling asleep or going on a journey or ascending to heaven. And these aren't literally true. They're the metaphors that we use. But they're not just the language. They also affect the way that we bury people, for example, so that, to use a well-known example, if you think of Norse ship burials, they're making a material form out of this metaphor of going on a journey to Valhalla in a ship. Or in more recent times, the metaphor that probably dominates our thinking is falling asleep. And you can see in the early modern period that people start burying their dead in nightclothes and putting a little pillow under their head. And that all looks very natural to us, but there's no reason why we should do that, except that we're making material a metaphor that's already in our heads. So that was my interest. That's where I came in. And I just thought this is such an interesting area. Of course, as well as archaeologists, most of our data, a ton of our data, comes from the grave. That's a big source of our information. So I didn't want to talk about that as though that was just incidental. I wanted to put death in the foreground and think about how people have related to the dead.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of archaeology in some ways is storytelling, and kind of through inference and deduction, kind of working out what the truths were of that time when we don't really have much information. And I suppose in that sense, you mentioned earlier that death is a very emotional thing. And so would you say that there was a difference between the way that we kind of perceive the emotional side of death today compared to maybe going back 100, 200, 300 years? And would we have felt, or would they have felt emotion in the same way around death? Would it have been a celebration rather than something to mourn and grieve? Or like, how do we even go about understanding that if there's hardly any evidence?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And it's super challenging. It's really hard. But I thought, no, we need to start from the point of view that we don't know what people in the past experienced. We can't assume that they were just like us. I think we probably can assume that death was always an emotional experience, but whether that emotion was sadness or anger or fear or joy or a combination of all of those things, we can't know for sure. So that's something where we have to keep an open mind, really, in trying to investigate the past. But you're absolutely right. Archaeology is storytelling, and we never know we're right. We never know we've got the right story. We never know that we've reached the final conclusive facts about the past. What we do is we take the scraps that we've got and we put them into something that's plausible, that makes a nice, interesting picture, that gives us something of the texture of people's lives in the past.
I like that about archaeology, though. I like that you can admit that you're not 100% certain. Unlike the sciences, for example, once you have a discovery or you hypothesize and then you prove it to be correct or incorrect, it's very solid. And we've spoken to guests in the past about this sort of thing, the difference between being open-minded about maybe this isn't how it was, maybe this is how it was, and being a bit more sort of stuck in your beliefs, so to speak. But yeah, I like that you're open to being wrong about things.
It's always only ever provisional, and it's only ever plausible. It could be disproved, but it's not even a case of proving or disproving most of the time. It's that I've come up with one story about the past and you might come up with another story, and we might both be right, because the past is really complicated and people are really complicated and people are quite different. So my experience won't necessarily be the same as your experience or Giles's experience. So
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's a difference between the individual and society as a whole. And we spoke to an author a few months ago, actually, on the pod. Great author and actor called Patterson Joseph, and he had been doing research on a historical figure, but had kind of made like a non-fiction book out of his life. And he was saying that in compiling that information, it was less about finding out information about him as a person, but more about society at the time, and then having to kind of make presumptions based on that specific person based in that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's what I've ended up doing really with my archaeology of emotion, the work on that, to think, actually, I don't even understand my friends and close family. I don't even understand myself half the time. So to get at those deep psychological truths at an individual level seems quite difficult. But I can look at a society as a whole, and I can look at our society and say, well, there are certain emotions that we really value. Romantic love would be one of those, because it's everywhere. It's everywhere in our culture. And that's not universally the case in all cultures and at all times. But I think you can say that is an emotion that kind of characterises the way that we live at a particular time, even if it doesn't characterise every single individual in our society.
Yeah.
So what kinds of cultures have you kind of explored around, in the years that you've covered with your archaeology? What it'd be interested to hear some anecdotal kind of things about practices and stuff around death and burial and grieving.
Yeah, well, I'm quite interested in more recent periods. So I've mostly looked at the post-medieval period, the last 500 years or so, mostly in Britain and Ireland. And I've looked at the way that our modern patterns of emotion and of bereavement and grieving have developed. So, for example, I could look at something like the way that we tend to bury people, how we bury people. In the medieval period, for example, people tended to get buried temporarily. They would go into a single grave in the graveyard, and most people wouldn't have any kind of monument or any kind of permanent marker at all. And after maybe 10, 15 years, the space would be needed again. So their bones get cleared to the side and somebody else goes in. That, incidentally, if you go to rural churchyards, you'll often notice they may be a metre or so higher than the surrounding ground.
Oh,
What
interesting.
that
Okay.
metre or so of extra elevation is people. It's maybe 1,000 or 1,500 years worth of buried people which have worked to actually raise the ground level in old churchyards.
Wow.
So that's a thing you can look at.
Yeah.
However, from the end of the 18th century, people stop wanting that, and they get very anxious about how they want to be in the ground in perpetuity. They often also want to get buried with their families or with their spouse, which is not something you see before that. So it becomes a much more emotional thing. And the decay of the body is something that people get very anxious about from the end of the 18th century, and they try and pretty it over so that memorial monuments stop having decaying skulls and things on them, and they start having flowers and angels and pretty things. And we develop this new metaphor of going to sleep that you see in people's practices and also the language they use. So that's the sort of thing that I've been studying over the last 30 years.
So would it be safe to say that over the course of the last sort of 500 years, we've become maybe a little bit more precious about death and see it as potentially more of a taboo subject? You know, it seems to be that we're kind of trying to pretty it and make it less about what it actually is. Is that, I don't know if it's a religious thing or if it's more that we as society sort of find it harder to cope with death and the idea about death. What would your predictions be about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on. I mean, this is the period of the Protestant Reformation. So there was a change then, because if you were in late Catholic times, in the pre-Reformation period, and somebody close to you died, you would go to church and you'd say lots of masses for them. You could even pay somebody else to say lots of masses and prayers for them. And that would all affect what was going on for them in the afterlife. So they would spend less time in purgatory because you're asking the saints to intercede on their behalf. Now, Protestants didn't believe in that. They said, oh no, once you die, you're on your own before God. So that meant that the bereaved they couldn't do anything. They couldn't do anything to help the person who's gone. All they could do was remember them. And I think at the same time you have the kind of rise of these romantic, highly emotional, interpersonal relationships that are very centred in the body, and they're very centred in the individual body. And it's about, I love you because you are unique and special. And when that unique, special individual person dies and their body dies, that's a real problem then for me. So you need to find some way of kind of mediating that relationship then, the relationship between the living and the dead, which I don't know if you've come across this idea of continuing bonds, but people who work in death studies and bereavement care and so on these days talk a lot about continuing bonds, and they make the point that when somebody dies, that's not necessarily the end of the relationship. The relationship continues in all sorts of ways, and you might mediate it through photographs and objects, through your own rituals, through remembering people in formal and informal ways, but the relationship goes on. So
that's interesting, because I read a thing about, for example, social media pages. So like Facebook pages, people will keep them open as memorials to those people. They might even continue posting as that person, or not as them, but through their pages is a way of continuing their life in some way, which is really interesting that we've taken it into a digital age now.
Yeah. No, it is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, really fascinating. Tell us a bit about your book and how you came to write it, and a bit about your husband Mark and the condition that he had, and how the book came about and wanting to write a memoir. Okay,
so Mark was also an archaeologist, and yeah, we got together. In fact, we were both interviewed for the same job.
Really?
That was how
right.
met. We met on the train on the way to the interview, and then we shared a taxi from the station. And I realised as soon as I started talking to him that I didn't stand a chance. and indeed, he got the job. But then another job came up at the same place a few years later. It was the University of Wales, Lampeter. And then we ended up being colleagues. And then a couple of years after that, we got together. And and we had children, we were living together. But then in about 2011, 2012, he started to experience minor seizures, and we didn't know what they were. He had so many scans and so many tests, and they could see that there was an inflammation in his brain, and the inflammation over the next few years just spread and spread and spread. No real cause was ever discovered for what was going on there, but in the end it went right through his brain and down into his spinal cord, and by the end of his life he was bedridden, he was doubly incontinent, he couldn't smell or taste, he couldn't always see very well, he was in constant discomfort. It was really a horrible condition of life that he had at the end. And in the end, what he did was wait until I was out of the house with the children, and then he took some drugs that he'd acquired online and ended his own life. And he didn't tell me he was going to do that because he wanted to keep me safe from prosecution. So he did this, I think, enormously courageous, loving thing. And he died. And to begin with, right after his death, I couldn't have written this book. I was just too tired. Apart from anything else, I was absolutely exhausted from several years of caring for him. But after a few years, I thought I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to write it for, well, 3 reasons really. First of all, because I was angry about the way that Mark died. I was angry that he had to die alone, and he would have wanted for me to be there with him at that most difficult time. Not only did he have to die alone, he couldn't tell anybody about what he was thinking. He couldn't get sort of psychological support or anything like that for making that decision. So he was really isolated because of our laws, and I think that's wrong. And so I felt that was something I was angry about and I wanted to write about. Secondly, when I was caring for Mark for several years, that was a really hard time. I was working full time, taking care of 3 kids and a house, and Mark, who was getting sicker and sicker and being able to do less and less. And I'm a book nerd, and I think I'm among friends here.
You're in good company.
What we do when we're experiencing something is turn to literature, and I went and looked for echoes of my experience in literature, and I was looking through other people's memoirs to see if they were talking about their caring experience. And the only experiences I found, they were all very romantic, and it was very angelic, and people were so patient, and the only thing they cared about was love for their sick person that they were caring for. And I was thinking, am I the only person who's feeling really grumpy and tired and self-pitying and all these other kind of quite unattractive emotions? So I wanted to write an honest memoir that reflected what I found the reality of caring to be, which was horribly stressful, and it didn't bring out the best in either of us. So that was another thing. And then the third thing was I wanted to see if I could write something that was a piece of literature, because I've written a ton of books, but they've all been academic ones. And it was brilliant, I must say, absolutely so liberating to be able to write a book without any footnotes, without having to put in graphs and tables to substantiate every point you make, just to write in the style that you want to. So those were the reasons why I wrote the book.
And it would be an obvious question to say, was it a cathartic experience? But sometimes writing about these very personal things aren't cathartic. They can be very challenging. Did you find it a challenging write?
I didn't find it challenging. I didn't think I was finding it cathartic either. I thought I wasn't writing it for therapy. I wasn't writing it because I thought better out than in or anything like that. I was writing it for those other reasons. But then I think, having written it, I look back over what I'd written, and I think finding the narrative, finding the story, it's the same process as archaeology. You get all these scraps and pieces and inadequate memories, and you cobble them together into a story, and that's what I'd done. And having done that, I was able to look at the character of me with a bit more compassion and a bit more forgiveness, because I think at the time and when I was writing it, I was still very angry with myself. I was still very aware of all the respects in which I'd fallen short. And I think the process of writing the story and finding the narrative enabled me to see the picture a little bit more kindly than I did at the time. So I think inadvertently it was therapeutic.
Yeah, and I would say in the book you are quite self-deprecating and hard on yourself. And I guess, like you say, this has kind of been a self-care moment, actually writing the book.
Yeah, I think maybe inadvertently it was, yes. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think in the moments of grief after death as well, quite a lot of people are guilty of romanticizing and looking at memories of rose-tinted glasses. And I know there's a bit in the book that you talk about Mark's hair clippers and how that could be seen as, you know, this beautiful moment where you would cut his hair for him, but actually the truth was a lot more sort of, you know, you were a bit annoyed at him because he hadn't considered your feelings when he'd bought them and presumed you were going to cut his hair for him, and you were kind of doing it, you know, dragging your heels and stuff. I think we can all relate to that. I mean, I think it's an excellent book, and it is quite emotional at times. I got quite emotional reading it, and I haven't experienced what you've experienced. We will have our own experiences of grief and loss in different ways, but I think a lot of people can relate to that and can relate to sort of the idea of looking back on these memories and romanticizing and then thinking, well, actually, I wasn't very patient, or, you know, that's universal, I think.
That's right. And I think, again, it's about finding the narrative. It's about finding the story. And particularly after a death like Mark's, which was following a very long, drawn-out period of illness, which was really hard on the whole family, it's easy after that kind of death just to remember the end of his life, to remember the last few years. So actually going back and remembering this sexy, cool, intellectual man that I was first drawn to, and think, actually, yeah, that was Mark too. That was also part of the story, and that was an important thing for me to do.
Yeah, I have to say, the story of how you two met, when I was reading it, I was thinking this could actually be a film. I can imagine this being like, have you seen what's that film called with Rachel McAdams? Is it About Time, where they go back, he pauses and could go back in time and stuff like that. It's a sort of like romantic, English, quirky film. And I could imagine, like, just the way you met and like the coincidences and the serendipity of it all. It's very romantic. And I was reading it thinking, yeah, this could be I would watch this if this was a film. So yeah, it's nice to hear that that's how it kind of made you feel as well. It reminded you of those good times.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, it's fun, isn't it? I was thinking just then when you were saying about piecing together that person from your memories, and thinking about, I lost my mum at 6, so I didn't have much of a relationship with her because obviously I was very young. But a lot of the narrative around her when I was talking to family and stuff was about her illness, because she had terminal cancer. And a lot of it was around that, as opposed to, I don't know, the music she liked, or the things she liked going out to do, or having meals and things like that. And it's trying to find those things later in life is a lot harder, because, you know, when your narrative is based around the care and that individual being, you know, unwell.
Yeah, I think that's particularly the case for a child, because your memory, you don't really have memories of your parents as individuals and as individual characters till you're a bit older, usually anyway. So I know my youngest son has been really interested to try to find out more about what his dad was like, other than just, you know, a man that was ill and then died. And he's always really interested to talk to Mark's friends about what Mark was like when he was younger and get a sense of him as an individual.
Yeah, that's interesting. Funny enough, I was going to ask you about, like, you know, obviously having to deal with having 3 young children as well, and taking on the burden of grief for them as well, and how we relate to children around grief. Because I was saying to Sophie on the way up before this today that it was kind of not talked about in our house. Like, you know, once, particularly after my mum had died, it was like became, you know, we talked about taboos and stuff, but it was like almost an unspoken thing. And I wondered now with my own children, my wife lost her father at a young age as well, and we're very open about, you know, losing our parents and what that meant, and the emotional baggage of that and the trauma of it. Have you been always tried to be quite open and candid with your your children around it?
I think so. They've all been quite different in the ways that they've dealt with Mark's death and how much they've wanted to talk about it and engage with it. But it was very important to me that they knew the whole circumstances right from the beginning. I wanted them to know that he'd chosen to end his own life. And I didn't want that to be a taboo. I wanted them to be proud of him for doing such a brave thing, as I am. And actually, Greg, the youngest, he'd only just turned 11 when his father died. It was 2 days after his 11th birthday. And he said to me, well, I'm happy to know that. I'm pleased to know that he wanted to die. That's so much better than him wanting to be alive and not being able to. And I thought, well, that's a different way of looking at his death, and a very mature one, actually, for an 11-year-old child.
Oh, very mature, and I suppose there comes an element as well of the choice of when and how as well, because I've lost people as well, and none of them have had that choice of how they die and when. And I remember when my mum passed away shortly after my birthday and shortly after Mother's Day, but before my sister's birthday. And so I think there was always that kind of, it was horrible anyway because she passed away, and then we all had to celebrate my sister's birthday, like, oh, happy birthday. It was probably like 14 days later or something. We all had to sort of celebrate my sister's birthday without her. But then there was also that kind of feeling like, oh, I wish she was here for my birthday. She could have just held on a little bit longer. So it's actually nice that he had, your youngest had that birthday with Mark before he passed away.
Yeah, and I think Mark was waiting as well for a moment when we would be out of the house, which there weren't very many opportunities actually, so he took the opportunity when it came.
Yeah, I can imagine. Oh, it is a heavy topic, and I know that the topic of people deciding to take their own lives, and particularly euthanasia in general, in legal terms as well, can be quite a heavy and polarizing topic, and people have varying sort of experiences and varying opinions of that as well. I'm guessing your opinion of that is that it should be legal.
I think assisted dying should be available for people who want it, and obviously we need to have safeguards and we need to have controls, and they're quite right to have reservations and to have anxieties about how it can be done safely. But interestingly, in the countries where assisted dying is legal, it hasn't been a big problem that people feel like they're being coerced into it, or that doctors are abusing their power, or any of those things that people worry about. So I think it shouldn't be beyond our wit to come up with a solution. And I think in the meantime, when it's not legal, there is so much suffering that's going on, and people are being left unsupported in a really difficult time.
Yeah, I totally agree with you as well. I don't know how you feel about it, Giles, but it's just.
I agree. Yeah,
I think when
on the same page.
Yeah, I think when you've experienced that as well, and you've known someone that's suffered. I mean, whether that be from a sort of unknown illness or a kind of terminal disease that people know a lot about. Either way, I think we've all had that thought of what would I do if there was the option? I don't think anyone would really take it lightly and decide to end their life just on a whim. It's a huge topic.
No, but I think knowing that you have control makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I think only about 2/3 of the people who get clearance for assisted dying, and in the Netherlands somebody did a study, and they can acquire the drugs and they have them at home, and only about half of them, or just over half of them, ever take them. But they know they're there.
Yeah.
And I think knowing that you have an option, knowing that you're going to have control, makes it more possible for you to bear what you're going through. I think the closest analogy for me is giving birth, which is maybe a bit different. But I think when I had my children in a situation where I knew that I could get pain relief, as much pain relief as I wanted, if I wanted it, and knowing that I could, I then gave birth with minimal pain relief, and that was fine, and I had the kind of experience that I wanted. But I think I could only have that experience that I wanted because I knew that I had options and I had control, and it was never going to be too much for me because I could always ask for
you take
something heavier.
Yeah, you take the fear element away from it. And actually, thinking about it now, I think one of the saddest things about watching somebody that you love pass away is seeing them experience that fear and seeing them go through the emotional turmoil. There was actually a documentary a while back. Louis Theroux did one on assisted dying, and it was a sad documentary. It was a hard watch, and I watched it once and was like, I don't think I could watch that again now. But I will say the people that the families and the people that had opted to have assisted dying in America, they all seemed relatively happy and calm, and they knew what was going to happen. There was no panic and fear and just all of the horrible emotions that usually come with having a sort of terminal disease. And it was quite refreshing, I would say. But it's interesting that you kind of compare death to giving birth, because I think they're so different in terms of societally how we talk about them and how we approach them, right? So when you're giving birth or you're expecting, everyone's talking about it, everyone sees you and they're like, oh, how exciting, have you decided what your plan is? And you come up with a plan, and you have, even if it doesn't quite go to plan, you have your birth plan, and you have a midwife and in some cultures a doula, and all of these sort of very spoken about societal sort of ways of giving birth and going through that process. And yet with death, it's kind of the complete opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. We don't have all the classes and the books and the help and the groups and the conversations that are really easy to have around birth. And that's a big change from, we were talking about how things were in the past. And I start the book by talking about this category of literature that we don't have anymore, called Ars Moriendi, the art of dying. And this was real bestseller stuff in the late Middle Ages and right through into the early modern period. These went to kind of 25, 30 editions, all of these books on how to die.
There's a gap in the market, quick.
Yeah. You're an author, Charles.
I'm on it. Yeah. But because of the period in which they're written, the preoccupation is kind of religion and how to die a theologically appropriate death and so on. But the kind of the bigger picture is that they describe death. They talk about what's going to happen to the body. They talk about the senses leaving the body one by one. They talk about the things that you might feel, what might go wrong, what are the kind of the temptations that will assail you, what's the despair that you might feel, the anxiety, the fear, all of those things that you might feel on your deathbed, that you might experience on your deathbed, and how you should address them. And it's interestingly, when they talk about the deathbed, people don't die alone as well. They're in a room full of their friends and neighbours and family and priests and then angels and saints and things all hanging around as well. So it's a really crowded space. It's very different, the way that death is so kind of pushed to one side in society now. And I think the other interesting thing there is today we see death as a failure. Something's gone wrong if you die. It's a failure of medicine, or it's your own failure. You just haven't fought hard enough. You just didn't have enough will to keep alive.
Or the loved one's failure for not,
they didn't
doing
keep you
enough.
alive. They didn't make you go to the doctor soon enough. They should have done this, done that. But in those Ars Moriendi literature, nobody ever dies of anything. They just die. And it's completely understood that this is just what happens. And it might be tomorrow, or it might be in 30 years, but at some point I'm going to die, and it's just going to happen. And I think we've lost that now, because we spend so much energy on trying to keep alive and trying to avoid anything that might cause you to die. But ultimately it's not going to work. However much salad I eat and however much jogging I do, I know how this story is going to end.
Yeah.
And we all do. And it's going to end the same way for all of us. So I think that's a really important cultural, social issue that we should be confronting, is how we can have those conversations in a less weighty way, the way that we might have them about giving birth and so on. So just exploring the options and not waiting till everything is really desperately intense and we're on our deathbeds.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder if people think about death as much as I do, because it's like a daily thing. I'm like, is this going to cause my death? Is that going to cause my death? If I eat this now, is that going to, in 10 years' time, give me some disease and then I'm going to die? You know, it's always in the back of my mind. I mean, obviously, I'm a bit of an extreme case because I experienced illness from quite a young age and then death a little bit later on in life. But yeah, I feel like it might be a burden easier to carry if it was spoken about a little bit more in society, and there were books and there were groups for people going through stuff like that, and the same sorts of things that you have set up for birth and pregnancy.
Yeah, I think, like you, I spend a lot of time thinking about death. It's not taboo for me because that's what I spend all my life on. But having published the book, I've been quite touched by how many people have written to me to share their stories or approached me to tell me about their own experiences. And what so many of them have said is that they didn't have a space to have those discussions. They didn't have a space to talk about what was going to happen or what had happened to their loved ones or what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, well, people don't know what to say, do they? I mean, we spoke about this earlier on in the car driving up, like when somebody's loved one passes away, you just don't know what to, even if you've experienced it yourself. I mean, I've experienced loss, and when my best friend's brother died, I was like, I don't know what to say. I think I just said to her, I honestly don't know what to say.
Well, you apologise. That's the first thing we apologise, don't we? That's the first thing that comes out of our mouth.
That's true. Yeah.
I think people worry maybe a bit too much about saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Because honestly, you can say the wrong thing, but it's almost certainly better than saying nothing at all. And there's probably no right thing, but I think just acknowledging that something has happened and that you're there, that's really good. But I think it must have been hard for you because you said you lost your mother when you were 19.
Yeah, I did. So my mum actually got ill for the first time when I was 10. I believe, although my memory is not great. So she got ill when I was 10 with breast cancer and was very unwell and was sort of fighting that off for quite a while, had various surgeries and chemo and stuff. Eventually she was in remission, and then it came back when I was 18. She was actually, in fact, I won't go into the details. I don't want people listening to panic and be like, oh, what if that happens to me? But anyway, came back when I was 18, just over a year of illness, where as a family we were all looking after her and going through the motions, hospital appointments and various things like that. Died in March when I just turned 19. And in my head, for some reason, I thought that she'd been ill for a month. So, I mean, it's been described and explained to me by various people as sort of like some kind of PTSD. Basically, I completely dissociated. It was like nothing had happened, basically. I didn't talk to anyone. Back then, we're talking well over 10 years ago now, so therapy wasn't as talked about or acceptable in society. It was kind of a bit embarrassing still, just on the cusp of things changing a little bit. I remember literally like walking out of the hospital and the nurse just gave us a pamphlet on grief and was like, okay, see ya. And we just went home and carried on our lives. And again, similar to you, Giles, it was never really spoken about too much in the home. We spoke about it a little bit. And we still talk about my mum from time to time, but yeah, it was possibly because we never spoke about it that I didn't actually find out my memory was false until maybe like 8 years after she had died. And suddenly it came to light. I was like, hold on, a year? I thought she had been ill for a month. And I just blocked out all these memories. And like we'd gone on holiday as a family and stuff. It was just absolutely crazy. But it does make me think it's so bizarre how different all of our experiences of death and suffering and grief. Oh, because from the outside looking in, I probably looked like I wasn't grieving at all because I was just kind of like straight back to work, like, yeah, fine, happy, going out, seeing friends. So
I think crazy. It's particularly hard when you're young because your contemporaries haven't experienced what you've experienced or anything like it. And they don't know what to do. And I know this was a problem for, my kids, that their friends at school.
Yeah.
They had no idea, or they could say, oh, well, yeah, my guinea pig died. And I was
upset about that.
But they didn't really have anything.
It's hard to relate,
to relate to that.
Absolutely. I mean, I still to this day remember the first person that I knew whose mum died when we were kids, and I barely knew him. I'd never met his mum, and yet I remember it being this really shocking, like, oh, she's died. Oh my God. Like, I could not believe, my little head couldn't comprehend that happening, because it's like a tragedy on a scale that I just couldn't imagine, because I'd never experienced anything like that
Well, I
before.
think similar to you, I think I felt that slight burden of knowledge, like the fact that I was the person whose mum had died, and then everyone would see you as the kid whose mum had died.
That's really interesting that you've both mentioned that, and certainly I experienced that. People have expectations of what it's going to be, and in a way you're a channel for their grief. They empathise with how they imagine you must be feeling, and that I remember thinking after Mark died, people are imagining the experience now of being a young widow, and I am kind of a lightning rod for their grief, and they've got expectations about how I should kind of perform this role of young widow. But sometimes it's a really complicated business going through a bereavement, and sometimes you want to cry, but sometimes you don't, and sometimes you want to laugh, and sometimes you want to ignore it, and sometimes you just want to sleep for a week, and there are all sorts of different things.
I was going to say, did you ever feel conscious of someone else's like interpretation of that then? Because I was thinking like, the idea, because you see things on TV, like people say, oh, they've lost someone, but they're not acting like they've lost someone.
Suspicious.
Do you know what I mean? There's that kind of expectation that you should behave in a certain way.
Well, I think that's it, and I think, we're all kind of, everybody's got the kind of the therapy speak thing, you should have, everyone said you should have counselling. And I thought, well, I think actually I'm coping all right. Considering, I'm not sure what I would go and ask a counsellor for at the moment, because this is just what happens. I don't think there's anything really pathological going on here. But I think also people thought that if I wasn't expressing my grief, it was because I was deliberately keeping it down, and that I should be encouraged to express how I was really feeling. And because they knew how I must be really feeling, and if I wasn't expressing it in the way that they identified with, then
are you sure you're okay?
Yeah, that's right. I know you're not really. I know that this is how you must be feeling.
Yeah, exactly. And you get sort of like films and TV shows and stuff like that. I don't know if you've seen that film P.S. I Love You. It's all like a very romanticised and extreme and dramatic version of losing a loved one, and essentially in the film her husband dies, and then turns out before he'd passed away he'd written her a letter every, I don't know, few weeks or something. I'm guessing I'm the only person that has seen it in this room, because you're both looking at me with blank faces. But it's, it's got Gerard Butler in it. It's super romantic, and she's like doesn't eat for a month because she's just so heartbroken and stuff. And I think people see films like this, or like your typical breakup films or whatever, and they expect that that's how you're feeling and that's what it should look like. But actually, in that moment after Mark had passed away, you possibly didn't need therapy, or it wasn't the right time for you.
And I think it was also, because of the way that Mark died and because of his illness, I remember saying at the time, it's not his death that's the tragedy, it's his illness that's the tragedy. I don't have that feeling of, I just wish I could have him back for a bit longer, because he was having a horrible life, and we were all having a horrible life.
You wouldn't wish that.
I wouldn't want to extend that long tail of pain and misery that his life went into. So the death was not the big problem. I think it's very different for people who lose someone suddenly or unexpectedly or after a very short illness. That's quite a different experience.
I think that comes with its own stuff to unpack, though, doesn't it? Because then, you've got probably various different elements of guilt, and you mentioned earlier about the fact that you weren't with Mark, whereas other people might feel guilty that they didn't get to say goodbye, or they didn't ever tell the person that they loved them, and stuff like that. There's elements of grief and heartbreak to unpack in death in many different circumstances, I guess. But
I wouldn't say I do feel guilty. I don't think I do feel guilty. I feel some regrets, but I don't feel guilty.
That's good.
Yeah, and we touched on it a little bit earlier. I was thinking the idea around a good death, and you mentioned earlier that there was, back in, hundreds of years ago, you would have like a gathering of loved ones and neighbours, and and obviously the more religious aspects of thinking there are angels surrounding your body. But is there such a thing as a good death?
Yeah, I think there are good deaths for people, and we don't always get the choice about how we die, and we don't all get to have a good death. But I think we should do more to make sure that the people who can do have a good death. And I think it's one, Sophie said, one without fear, one where you're not in pain, where you're not anxious, where you've got control, where you can be with people. It's nice if you can die when you're still aware of what's going on. And I think for most people, they don't actually, do they? They die. They're in a drugged out haze or with advanced dementia or whatever. So that's not always possible. But a kind of a clear-headed falling asleep at a moment when you're expecting it, when you've said what you need to say, and you feel that there's not a lot of stuff left undone, and you've taken control of what you can take control of. That would be a good death. That's what I want.
Yeah, because you get some people that are like, oh, I just want to drop dead in the street from a heart attack and not feel any pain, not know it's coming, or fall asleep and just never wake up and stuff like that. But I suppose then you've got, well, I guess once you're gone, it probably doesn't matter too much to you, the people left behind, but then you've got the people that are left to pick up the pieces and grieve the loss. And I suppose if those people do get that goodbye, then that's good for both parties, I suppose.
Yeah.
I was reading an article yesterday, and it was about my wife put me onto it. I don't know how it came up, but something called the Swedish death clean.
Oh yeah, yes, I mentioned that in the book.
Actually. Oh yeah,
yes.
And I was reading a bit more about it, and it was fascinating because it's the idea that we would, because I remember when my grandmother passed away, we had to clear out her flat, and it was such a rigmarole to get through all this stuff, and she was a bit of a hoarder, so there was just crap everywhere. But I like the idea of that, the fact that we would we're going to cleanse our palettes, our life palettes, so that the next person, the people don't have to pick up too many pieces afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea. So you're not encumbering all your family and your relatives with going through all of your stuff. And I think another thing that was pointed out was you might want to take care of what old letters you're keeping and what you've written in diaries. There may be things that you don't want your children to know about from your earlier life.
I remember helping a friend out with when his father passed away, and we went up to his loft, and there was 4 VHS recorders in there. He just kept all these VHS recorders, and you just thought it was hilarious. And he was passing them down to me. He was like, I've got another one, And it's these sort of things that, which I think in that moment actually was nice for him, because it was so funny that his father kept all these things, and it was just kind of lightened the moment a bit of this, which otherwise was quite a horrible thing, like sorting out a house that's been left. I want to ask you about how your relationship with death is now, obviously having been through this experience with Mark and your work. And has it changed the way you look at death overall, or the way you approach it with your work? Has it sort of informed you in a certain way?
I was already interested in quite a lot of those topics. Anyway, I was already interested in emotions and death. I think it's been interesting because I spent a lot of time imagining, because I spent a lot of time thinking about death, and I spent a lot of time imagining what it would be like to lose a spouse and how I would feel, and then to go through the experience and find that actually it wasn't quite like that. That was interesting to me. Right after Mark died, I thought, I just don't think I can face this anymore. I don't want to work on death for a while. And I actually planned out a whole new research project on the history of false teeth.
A little bit different.
That would be really fun. Also, there's so many puns you can make.
Yeah. That is like a work palate cleanser, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'd written this whole new research direction. It was called Didn't You Wish Your Girlfriend Was Fine?
Oh, nice.
But then every couple of years. Now I seem to be back doing death stuff again.
I'm just curious, when you decided to go on that route and you came up with that, were your colleagues kind of like, she's clearly not coping okay?
If they were, they didn't say it. They were much too polite.
She's having a breakdown right now. Yes. Well, I'm glad for your career that you went back on to talk about this, because the book is fantastic, and it's definitely worth a read. Yeah.
But yeah, so it has like slightly changed the way you approach the subject. Do you think
it's made me? I think before I've been writing about death for a long time, but I'd always written very academically, and this is the first time I tried to write for a general audience. And I think finding that people are interested, that people have so much that they want to talk about and they want to hear about, and they're interested in, and that people are interested in the way that archaeologists work as well, and the way that we think. That's been really interesting to me, and it makes me think that actually there is work for me. There's more work for me to do there, writing about death and a good death, and trying to reflect a little bit on from what we know from other cultures and other times and places. Does that help us to understand the breadth of possibility, and to see what decisions we're making, to make them it makes them how am I going to say this? We see that our way, we often don't see what we do. We don't see what we take for granted until you see other cultures or other times who do things differently. And so when that happens, that causes you to reflect on your own practice. And I think that's something that's really great about archaeology and history for me, and anthropology, I think, is kind of the same, that you can see another way of doing things. And when you've got that broader range of practices, it illuminates how specific and sometimes how odd the things that we do actually are.
Actually, on that, are there cultures or countries in the world where they do the death thing better? Like they are, I mean, obviously we have like the Mexican Day of the Dead and things like that, where it's a very big celebration. Are there other cultures where they, because I feel like we're quite repressed in Britain,
I
for
think
example.
we make a big separation between the living and the dead. We want the body gone. We don't often go and visit it after it's been buried, or we do something even more radical, which is cremate it and then scatter it to the winds. So you're really, really obliterating the physical traces of the dead. And that contrasts with, for example, in certain prehistoric sites where the dead are buried underneath the floor of the house, and they're kept with the living. They're really a part of, one imagines they were really a part of life. Or there are communal tombs where the whole of a group would bury their dead in the same place, and perhaps have secondary rituals of death where the bodies get taken out and in and muddled up and churned about and so on. So their individual identity gets lost in a kind of communal identity over time, and that's an interesting process that we don't have. So I wouldn't say that people necessarily do it better, but I think that they sometimes do it differently. And there's a whole range of different ways. Some cultures have been really obsessed by death and thought about death a lot, and others like us now try not to think about it very much at all, and try to clear the dead away as much as possible and move on.
Bury our head in the sand.
But there's a whole range of options in between as well.
I like the idea of doing something with nature. Like you get some people that want to be like turned into a tree and stuff like that as well, which I think is quite interesting. But I guess we do. I was just thinking earlier in terms of the fact that we as a society, we do kind of bury our heads in the sand a little bit. And when we were talking about the Swedish death clean and how people, prepare for death by clearing out all of their old clutter, I was trying to imagine what that would look like in our families, if I sort of went to my dad and was like, right, time to get rid of all your old crap now. Garage, you're going to die soon. I feel like in some ways maybe we do tend to bury our head in the sand, because otherwise it feels a little bit like we're just waiting for people to die, past a certain age. You're like, right, well, there's no point in you being here anymore. Off you go. Pop your clogs, sort of thing.
I think that's why it's important to find a way of having those conversations early and in a non-weighty way, in a casual easy way.
Mm.
So perhaps, doing some death cleaning now while I'm not, to my knowledge. I'm not immediately facing death as far as I know. So this might be a good time to do those sorts of things and to have those early conversations.
I do death cleans every spring.
You're a better person than me.
Every time I move house, I do a death clean.
I might need to do one soon, but
if Michelle asks you what you're doing, just death cleaning, don't worry.
Just preparing for my own demise.
Well, photos and slides and things like that.
Oh man.
The last thing I wanted to ask you is about is you being a humanist celebrant. Am I right?
That's
right.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, it was actually when my father died, and my father was actually born into an Orthodox Jewish family, but through his life he became less and less religious, and by the end of his life he was really quite anti-religious. So it was clear that he didn't want a religious funeral, and we got a humanist celebrant to do his funeral. And she was great. She was really terrific, and I loved the whole idea that you've got a memorial that's focused on the person who died, that it's really about being a tribute to them. You can personalise this. And I thought, this is writing and talking, and that's what I do for my living anyway. I love writing and talking, and I thought perhaps I can do this. And I think the other attribute I have is that I'm really, really nosy. And so when you're a celebrant, you get to go into somebody's family.
Yeah.
And it's a big honour, because you get to be with them at a time of great difficulty, and to do something that's a bit helpful, to create a narrative, to make the story, and to put together a way of making sense of a whole life. And that's a massive privilege, and it's a wonderful thing to do. But I'm interested in people, and you get to hear everyone's story, and everyone's got a story, and they're so interesting and they're so different.
Yeah.
So I've always really enjoyed doing that.
It's like just being like an archaeologist. Have you thought about being an archaeologist? Yeah, I suppose actually as well, because archaeology, from what I understand, it's kind of you might find one specific object or thing or circumstance from a specific person and many, many years ago, and then you have to kind of branch out to the wider, what does that tell us about society and the country, and you go outwards. Whereas when you're a celebrant, you're kind of going inwards into someone's life, and it's very personal. It's kind of, in some ways, it's like the same, different side of the same coin, I'd say.
That's a really nice way. I hadn't thought of that, but it's a really lovely way of putting it. Yeah, no, you definitely do. Yes, we start as archaeologists taking these little a pair of hair clippers or whatever it is, and exactly, spiralling out from that to tell a story, to show a bigger picture of what's going on. But when we're taking writing somebody's life for their memorial service, you're taking a moment in history and distilling it down to an individual's experience.
I love that. That's really beautiful.
Well, Sarah, it's been so lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
The Archaeology of Loss you can get in all good bookshops, and I highly recommend it to anybody.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.